Stand down, nurse. The surgeon barked, and the trauma corridor snapped silent around him. The gurney was still moving. The patient's blood pressure was collapsing in real time. A portable monitor screamed as fluorescent light flashed over a bruised chest, a gray face under an oxygen mask, and an abdomen rising in a way no one in that hallway seemed to understand except one woman with gloved hands already red at the wrists. Nora Voss wasn't looking at the surgeon. She was looking at the scar crossing the unconscious man's abdomen, a hard, pale, diagonal seam no civilian surgeon would have made under clean hospital lights. She had seen that kind of scar once before in a place where the walls shook and the air smelled like dust, aviation fuel, and blood. And if this story already has you locked in, take a second to like the video, follow the channel, and tell me what city you're watching from, because what happened that night inside Harlow County General didn't end when the bleeding stopped. It spread into sealed records, ruined careers, a federal investigation, and a truth an entire hospital had been trained not to see. Because the man on that gurney was not dying for the reason everyone thought. And the only person who knew was the nurse the chief surgeon had just ordered to step aside. Now let's go back to the beginning. Harlow County General sold itself with polished glass and donor plaques. In daylight, the lobby looked like a brochure for modern medicine. Sunlight on stone floors, a piano in the atrium no one ever played, smiling physician portraits, slogans about excellence cut into brushed steel. Families took pictures there. Local magazines called it a rising regional leader. Board members loved giving tours through the bright parts. The trauma wing lived in another reality. Back there, beyond the public corridors, the building smelled like bleach, overheated wiring, stale coffee, and pressure. Doors stuck in humid weather. One of the supply room hinges had to be lifted before it would latch. The pneumatic tube jammed twice a week. A vital signs cart drifted left if you didn't correct it. Half the monitors had a battery issue everyone knew about, and no one had fixed. Harlow looked polished from the front because people in the back absorbed the damage in silence. At night, the illusion thinned. Administrators went home. Donors vanished. The piano sat in the dark. The hospital belonged to the people who actually kept it alive. Transport orderlies who could run a bed through a doorway at full speed without clipping a frame, respiratory therapists who could hear a bad chest before the x-ray loaded, residents surviving on caffeine and fear, and nurses who could tell from the sound of a room alone whether a patient was getting better or whether the staff had simply become louder around a disaster. Nora Voss belonged to that world with the ease of someone who never needed to announce competence. She worked trauma nights, preferred the worst rooms, and never wasted movement. She came in early, checked suction herself, reset her pockets the same way every shift, and scanned a patient the way other people scan a page, fast, quiet, complete. She looked at fingers, lips, abdomen, pupils, chest rise, the angle of a jaw, the color under the eyes. She trusted patterns before she trusted confidence. She could start lines in collapsed veins, prime blood tubing without looking down, and catch a false reassurance hidden inside a monitor trend before it fooled anyone else. Nobody knew much about her. That was by design. There were rumors. Former military. Army maybe. Officer. Trauma somewhere overseas. Medevac experience. Combat medicine. Disaster response. People filled the empty space around her with stories because Nora never gave them much to work with. She did the job, handed off clean, and went home. She did not linger at the desk trading gossip. She did not talk over people to prove she knew more. She simply noticed what others missed, and the staff who mattered learned very quickly that when Nora Voss said something was wrong, it was already more wrong than the room understood. Dr. Marcus Hale ruled the trauma service the opposite way. He was the hospital's star surgeon, the name on the billboard campaign, the chief donors liked, the man administrators described as decisive. He was good enough to deserve authority and polished enough to turn authority into spectacle. He moved like a man who expected doorways to widen for him. In chaotic situations, he projected the kind of certainty people mistake for safety. Residents copied his phrasing. Administrators admired his efficiency. Local press called him brilliant. He was not a fool. He was more dangerous than that. He was smart, fast, practiced, and deeply allergic to contradiction, especially from below, especially from nurses. He preferred subtle humiliations to open shouting. A question ignored, a correction delivered in front of trainees, a thin smile before a cutting remark. He knew how to make someone else sound emotional simply by sounding composed while they tried to save time he was about to waste. He and Nora had never openly gone to war, but everyone in trauma knew the weather whenever they were on the same case. Hale disliked that she didn't defer to performance. Nora disliked anyone who used rank to outrun reality. The night everything detonated began badly and kept getting worse. 2 nurses called out. ICU was boarding patients because there weren't enough step-down beds. 1 floor had a plumbing issue. The ED waiting room was stacked. Triage already had more bodies than chairs. Storm heat pressed against the building, making tempers short and equipment unreliable. Ambulance radios kept chattering. Another inbound. Another one behind that. Nora was resetting a pump in Trauma 2 when EMS called the rollover. Male. Late 30s or early 40s. Found in a drainage ditch beside an SUV flipped off Highway 48 near the old industrial road. Unresponsive on scene, then combative, then drifting. Bruising the chest. Possible rib fractures. Abdominal distension. Hypotension. No obvious external hemorrhage. Dog tag found under the driver's seat. Identity probable, but not confirmed. Trauma 1, Nora said before anyone asked. Rosa Delaney, the charge nurse, was already stripping the bed and slapping on a fresh sheet. Eli Mercer, a second-year surgical resident with sharp eyes and not enough sleep, came in behind her carrying the ultrasound machine. Hale on tonight? He asked. Of course, Rosa muttered. The ambulance doors burst open 2 minutes later and rolled in heat, diesel, mud, and roadside violence. The patient looked like someone who had been assembled from impacts. Broad shoulders, tactical shirt cut half open, seatbelt bruising, blood at the temple, dirt on his forearms, oxygen mask fogging with fast, shallow breaths. Collar in place, one hand twitching against the blanket. His skin had that wrong gray tone trauma nurses know too well, the color people get when their body is still technically present but already rationing what it can afford to keep alive. Nora cut away the rest of his shirt and saw the scar, diagonal across the abdomen. Old, harsh, field closed, not cosmetically repaired. There were puckered fragment marks near one edge, tissue drawn tight by damage control surgery done for survival, not appearance. That kind of scar belonged to a body that had once been opened fast under impossible conditions and put back together just quickly enough to keep breathing. Her hands kept moving, but something colder than surprise moved through her. A surgical tent, a generator stutter, dust in the lights, a man refusing to go under quietly. Pressure 86/50, Rosa called. Pulse 138, Eli added. Breath sounds reduced on the left, he said after a fast listen. Abdomen firm. Marcus Hale strode in pulling on gloves. Portable chest. Pelvis. Fast. Type and cross. We stabilize and scan. He took possession of the room instantly. 2 interns shifted out of his path. The respiratory therapist moved closer. The transport orderly waited for orders. Nora had already placed 1 large bore 4 and was pushing for the second. The patient's abdomen felt wrong beneath her hand. Not just distended. Tightening. Hemorrhagic pattern, she said. Hale barely looked at her. Could be chest. Could be belly. We're not opening the abdomen based on a bruise and a bad pressure. Eli performed the fast exam. Subxiphoid. Right upper quadrant. Left upper quadrant. Pelvis. The images were muddy. Gas. Angle. Motion. Not clean enough to reassure anyone honest. Equivocal, Eli said carefully. Hale took the probe, swept once himself, then handed it back. Negative enough to move. Prep CT. Nora checked the blood pressure manually because she didn't trust the cuff anymore. The pulse at the wrist was thinning. It's dropping, she said. He's not stable. He'll never be stable in a trauma bay. Move him. Then the unconscious man tensed under her hands. Not random movement. Pain. Nora's eyes cut to the old scar, then to the abdomen under it. Scar tissue and adhesions from prior surgery could distort everything. Bleeding could hide. Signs could blur. A clean textbook pattern might never appear until it was too late. Marcus, she said. He hated when she used his first name in front of staff. What? That abdomen is not clean. He finally looked at her. You have concern. I have an assessment. You have one equivocal scan on a surgically altered abdomen in a hypotensive blunt trauma. We are not practicing surgery by intuition. This is not intuition. He turned away. CT now. Transport moved the bed. Nora hung the first unit of uncrossed blood anyway. I did not order massive transfusion, Hale said. I'm not waiting for a hemoglobin to catch up to the bleed. That is not your call. She didn't answer. She spiked the blood, opened the line, and watched dark red begin to run. The gurney rolled into the corridor. Eli followed with the ultrasound. Rosa came behind with the blood and chart. Hale walked at the left rail, still talking about chest injury, still framing the case around the explanation that preserved his original read. Then the blood pressure crashed again. 76 systolic. The patient's skin cooled. A gray shadow deepened at the flanks. His abdomen rose another fraction under the sheet. That was enough. Stop the bed, Nora said. No one did. She reached down and slammed the brake. The wheels locked so hard the four-pole rattled. Hale spun around. What are you doing? Eli had already seen her expression. He handed over the probe without being asked. Nora placed it in the right upper quadrant, angled deeper than a student would have, compensating for the old scar, the likely adhesions, the anatomy that had once been rearranged in a place where survival outranked neatness. There, a dark stripe. She swept again. Wider now. Free fluid. Hemoperitoneum, she said. Hale leaned in. Artifact from scar tissue. No, Eli said, before fear could stop him. I see it. For one moment, nobody moved. Then the patient's eyes cracked open. He turned his head toward Nora as if dragged there by instinct. And through the oxygen mask, through shock, through pain, he rasped one word. Major. Everything in the corridor stopped. Not nurse. Not ma'am. Major. Then his eyes rolled back, his body slackened, and the monitor alarm changed pitch. Back to trauma. Hale snapped, uncertainty finally leaking into his voice. No, Nora said. Or, you do not make that call. He's bleeding out. You do not know that. She looked at him once, steady as steel. I know enough. Stand down, nurse. Rosa's eyes moved from Hale to Nora. Nora never raised her voice. Activate hemorrhage protocol. Rosa hesitated for half a second. Then she reached for the wall phone. Overhead, the operator's voice cut through the corridor. Code hemorrhage. Trauma or. Code hemorrhage. Trauma or. Hale's face went white with anger. I did not authorize that. At that exact moment, Dr. Sanaa Imani came out of the surgical elevator, still tying her gown, took one look at the ultrasound screen in Eli's hand, one look at the patient's belly, and said, Why is this man not already in the operating room? No one answered because there was no defensible answer left. They ran. The next minutes were pure emergency mathematics. Either you helped or you became furniture. Anesthesia met them at the ER doors. Blood arrived in a cooler. The patient was intubated on the move. Imani called for warm fluids, TXA, calcium after the next units, suction, rapid infuser, vascular trays on standby. Hale scrubbed in because there was no way to retreat now without admitting the hallway had exposed him. Under the ER lights, the abdomen looked larger than it had in the hall. Knife, Imani said. The incision opened. Blood surged up. Not a trickle. Not uncertainty. A trapped internal catastrophe released all at once. Pack all quadrants, Imani snapped. More suction. Pressure. 62 systolic. More blood. The bleed was exactly the kind Nora had feared. Old combat surgery had left adhesions and altered pathways. New blunt force had torn a mesenteric branch and let blood collect where the first scan could miss it unless someone was looking with history in mind. The old scar hadn't just been background. It had been the entire warning. Nora worked the head of the bed and the lines like she had done it her entire life. She cleared tubing, pushed calcium, verified units aloud, watched waveform changes, checked the rapid infuser, tracked output, watched for the difference between movement and response. Nothing about her looked dramatic. That was what made it so unmistakable. She did not perform urgency. She functioned inside it. Gradually, the pressure stopped falling. Then it rose a little, then a little more. The room exhaled in fragments. Hours later, after clamps, packing, repair, transfusion, and the kind of exhaustive precision only real trauma teams understand, the patient was alive in ICU. At 4:17 in the morning, Nora walked out of the unit with blood on one shoe and deep red marks across the bridge of her nose from protective gear. Rosa was waiting with 2 coffees. "You saved him," Rosa said. "We saved him," Nora replied. Rosa didn't bother arguing. She only looked down the corridor where Paula Renwick, the hospital's chief operating officer, approached with Marcus Hale at her side. Renwick's suit was perfect. Her expression was administrative sympathy carved into stone. "Ms. Voss," she said, "I need your badge." Nora took one sip of coffee. "On what basis?" "Pending review of your conduct. You are being placed on immediate administrative suspension." Eli, standing near the charting station, went still. Rosa said she recognized the bleed. Renwick didn't even look at her. "This is about chain of command, unauthorized protocol activation, and interference with attending decision-making." Hale finally spoke, calm and measured again, now that the patient was no longer actively dying in front of him. "No one disputes Ms. Voss is experienced. But trauma care cannot function if nursing staff decide they may override surgical authority based on instinct." Nora unclipped her badge and placed it in Renwick's hand. "It wasn't instinct," she said. "That will be determined," Hale replied. By sunrise, the story had already split into lies. In one version, an unstable nurse with a military savior complex had derailed a surgeon's plan. In another, Hale had heroically managed a difficult trauma after a subordinate caused confusion. In a third, there had been screaming, chaos, security involvement. Hospitals create rumor the same way they create paperwork, continuously and in self-protection. Nora went home, showered, slept less than 2 hours, then sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began reconstructing the timeline from memory. Arrival. First blood pressure. First fast. Her manual recheck. Abdominal change. Uncrossed blood. Corridor stop. Repeat fast. Overhead page. Or transfer. Then she wrote the single word the patient had said. Major. And she stared at it. There are some memories the mind stores in images and some the body stores in reflex. The scar had triggered both. Years earlier, in a forward surgical setting overseas, Nora had been Army Nurse Corps. Major Nora Voss. A casualty came in under restricted identification after catastrophic abdominal trauma. Dust in the lights. Noise outside. Blood everywhere. A body held together just long enough for a team to improvise survival out of damage. The closure had been rough, diagonal, brutal, unforgettable. The man on her table that night had been Garrett Wills. She had not known then that she would ever see him again. At mid-afternoon, Rosa called. ICU restricted his chart, she said. Not normal protected status. Restricted. By administration and by somebody outside. Security made a pass through the unit. Federal credentials. Nora sat up straighter. Federal. Also, Hale's been in the chart all morning. How do you know? Because chart access logs exist for people smart enough to look. He entered a note after sunrise, making it sound like he wanted surgery before the hallway incident. Nora's jaw set. He didn't. I know. Preserve everything, Nora said. Rosa snorted softly. Already did. Biomed is holding the monitor archive. Blood bank release times are locked. Overhead operator saved the page log. That was the first real fracture in the cover story. Modern hospitals are full of people who assume records can be revised because screens look fluid. But behind every polished note sits a trail, metadata, access logs, edit times, archive clips, server copies, monitoring exports. Lies can be typed cleanly. They are harder to align. The next morning, Harlow scheduled a formal internal review. Not a courtroom, not even a full board hearing. Just one of those carefully sterile conference room meetings where administrators use concern as a weapon and legal pads as scenery. Paula Renwick was there. Hospital counsel was there. Marcus Hale was there. A recorder sat in the center of the table like a small black eye. Hale spoke first. Ms. Voss repeatedly acted outside the scope of nursing authority, delayed indicated imaging, activated a hemorrhage response without attending approval, and undermined team function in a critical trauma sequence. Nora listened without interrupting. Then counsel asked for her response. She folded her hands. The patient presented with blunt trauma, hypotension, a surgically altered abdomen, worsening rigidity, and deteriorating hemodynamics. The initial fast was equivocal. The attending favored CT. I repeated the scan in the corridor, identified free fluid, and activated hemorrhage protocol, because further delay was not clinically defensible. Hale leaned in. You're not qualified to diagnose operative abdominal hemorrhage. No, Nora said. I'm qualified to recognize it. He smiled without warmth. My decision-making was already progressing toward operative intervention before your outburst. That is false, she said. The room tightened. Renwick's voice lowered. Be very careful. I am. Then someone knocked. 2 even knocks. Not hesitant. Not administrative. Hospital counsel opened the door to a woman in dark civilian attire, holding a credential wallet and a man beside her carrying a sealed document envelope. I'm Commander Elise Rowan, Department of Defense, the woman said. This is Special Agent Daniel Pike. We are here regarding the patient treated here as Garrett Wills. Silence. Rowan stepped in, calm and exact. As of this moment, his treatment record, associated timing logs, and all chart access are under federal preservation order. Renwick stood. This is an internal staffing matter. It is now a federal records matter, Rowan said. Hale recovered first. With respect, this remains a hospital trauma case. No, Rowan replied. It does not. Pike placed the envelope on the table. The patient is active duty special operations personnel injured under circumstances under federal review. There is also evidence of record activity relevant to treatment timing. Hale glanced at Nora. She became personally involved. That was part of the issue. Rowan looked at him. You believe Ms. Voss overreacted because she recognized an old surgical scar? He said nothing. Rowan turned to the table and let the next sentence land where it would. For the record, Nora Voss served 13 years in the Army Nurse Corps and is separated at the rank of major. Her advanced trauma service history is a matter of record. Portions remain restricted. No one in the room moved. Hale's face changed first, then Renwick's. Pike continued in the same quiet tone. We will need monitor archives, ultrasound metadata, blood bank release times, hallway video, chart audit logs, and all related documentation preserved immediately. The review ended there because Harlow had lost control of the story. From that point forward, facts began arriving faster than the hospital could reposition itself. The bedside monitor trend from trauma 1 showed a clear decline in pressure before CT transport was attempted. Blood bank records matched the timing of Nora's decision to hang uncrossed blood. The overhead page log time stamped the hemorrhage activation before Hale's later chart note suggested he was already moving towards surgery. The hallway camera showed the bed rolling toward CT, the abrupt stop, the cluster around the right side, Dr. Amani arriving at speed, and the immediate pivot toward the OR. Then came the chart audit. Hale's note had been created from his office after 7 that morning. The system showed later edits. A sentence referencing CT when stable had been deleted and replaced with language implying earlier operative concern. He had also opened the ultrasound archive before finalizing the note. Rowan looked at the screen. This is more than a judgment issue. It got worse. A surgeon from another state called after hearing the outline through professional channels. Dr. Lena Quaid. Years earlier, she had trained under Marcus Hale at another hospital. She arrived with handwritten notes from an old morbidity review involving a trauma death after delayed recognition of internal bleeding. Different patient. Same pattern. Same dismissal of concern. Same phrase, written in her notes years earlier exactly as Hale had said it in Harlow's corridor. Artifact from adhesions. Another hospital emerged before that one. Then a settlement trail. Then credentialing gaps that had been technically disclosed but never meaningfully examined, because prestige tends to pass through institutions faster than caution. At Harlow, the mood changed from defensive to frightened. Residents spoke in lower voices. Administrators began saying they were cooperating fully. Nurses who had worked under Hale for years started remembering things they had once dismissed as single incidents. Garrett Wills woke on day 3. The ventilator was out. Tubes still ran from his chest. His abdomen was bandaged. He looked like a man who had come back from somewhere cold and expensive. Rowan arranged for Nora to see him. When she entered, he turned his head slowly and focused on her without confusion. "It was you," he said. "You lost a lot of blood," Nora answered. His mouth almost formed a smile. That usually means yes. For a while they said little. People who have seen each other under the worst conditions rarely need long explanations. "You recognize the scar," he said. "Yes. Kareen District," he murmured after a pause. Generator kept cutting out. She looked at him. "You remember that?" "I remember enough." He took a careful breath. "I also remember hearing someone say CT. Then I heard you. You weren't supposed to be listening. I wasn't supposed to be bleeding there either." The silence between them carried years. Then he said, "You saved me twice." "No," Nora replied. "A lot of people worked on you. That is still how you answer. It's still true." He turned his head slightly toward the window. "Then tell them this at your hearing. When I woke up, I knew 2 things. I was bleeding inside, and you were the only person in that hallway who already understood it." His sworn statement later included almost those exact words. Eli Mercer gave his statement too, and that mattered more than anyone first realized. He was young enough to be vulnerable and decent enough to risk that vulnerability. He confirmed the first scan had been equivocal. The attending favored CT. Nora repeatedly warned of abdominal hemorrhage. The repeat scan showed free fluid, and Hale dismissed it. Then he handed investigators something else. The handwritten notes he had made immediately after the case ended. Before sleep, before rumors, before the chart had time to harden around a lie. One line on that page became a blade in the final hearing. 4:01 a.m. Repeat RUQ view. Fluid visible. Dr. Hale says artifact from scar tissue. That was how truth survived this story. Not through speeches. Through people who wrote things down before power could rewrite the sequence. The full board hearing took place 8 days later in the executive conference suite overlooking the bright atrium. Down below, the piano still sat in polished silence, while sunlight made the place look respectable. Upstairs, respectability was about to come apart under documents. Nora arrived in a dark blazer, posture straight, expression unreadable. Rosa sat in the back. Eli sat 2 seats away, hands locked together. Dr. Sanaa Imani had operative records stacked in front of her. Lena Quaid appeared by video. Marcus Hale came in last, immaculate as ever. The hearing began with data. Monitor trends on a large screen. Blood pressure falling minute by minute. No sustained response before surgery. Then blood bank release times. Then the overhead page log. Then hallway video. No sound, just bodies moving in truth direction. Next came the ultrasound clips. The first ambiguous enough to argue. The second impossible to explain away if anyone in the room possessed honesty or vision. When the fluid stripe was frozen and enlarged, even the non-clinicians could see the dark crescent where blood had hidden behind anatomy and pride. Dr. Imani, counsel asked, was operative abdominal bleeding present at that time? Yes, she said, and delay would have been fatal. Then Pike presented the chart audit. Creation time. Edit history. Deleted text. Access from Hale's office. Ultrasound review before the note was finalized. Dr. Hale, Pike said, can you explain why your recorded chronology does not match server metadata, monitor trends, imaging timestamps, hallway footage, page logs, or witness notes? Hale tried the only path left. Emergency charting is often reconstructed after the fact. Reconstructed, Pike said evenly, or revised. Hale's attorney objected. The objection landed weakly because everyone in the room had already seen the sequence. Then Garrett's sworn statement was read aloud. Calm, direct, no performance. He described waking enough to understand he was deteriorating, recognizing Major Voss from prior military care, hearing disagreement, and placing his trust in the one voice that sounded less interested in being obeyed than in getting the answer right. Finally, Lena Quaid read from her years-old notes. Different hospital, different patient, same diagnostic blind spot, same treatment of contradiction, same quiet cleanup afterward. The room had nowhere left to hide. Marcus Hale testified in his own defense and made the mistake powerful men often make once the story stops favoring them. He leaned harder on the traits that once protected him. He became more polished, more measured, more offended by the suggestion of bad faith. He framed the case as a misunderstood judgment call in a difficult trauma setting. He implied subordinates were using hindsight to simplify complexity. It might have worked if the evidence were thin. It wasn't. Nora testified last. No theatrics, no revenge, no speech about being underestimated. She simply walked the board through the medicine, the anatomy, the scar, the hemodynamics, the repeat scan, and the timing. She explained exactly why old damage control surgery changes the threshold for suspicion. She explained why waiting for perfect imaging in a collapsing trauma patient can kill faster than uncertainty. She explained why chain of command matters until it begins to interfere with the patient in the bed. Board counsel asked, "Did you knowingly override the attending surgeon?" Nora answered, "I acted to prevent a patient from dying during a delay that was no longer clinically acceptable." Despite direct orders? Yes. Would you do it again? She did not look at Hale. She looked at the panel. If the facts were the same, she said yes. There are moments when an institution reveals what it truly values. Sometimes it protects rank, sometimes image, sometimes legal insulation, and sometimes, usually later than it should, it recognizes that the people carrying its weight have been invisible for too long. The board recessed. When they returned, Paula Renwick looked 10 years older. Marcus Hale was placed on immediate leave, stripped of clinical authority, and referred to the state medical board with recommendations for emergency suspension of license, pending full review. Harlow County General formally rescinded Nora Voss's suspension, restored her standing, and announced an external audit of trauma governance, credentialing, and chain of command policy. Federal investigators retained the record package. Additional cases tied to Hale's past employment were opened for review. Security met Hale at the door before the day was over. By the end of the week, state authorities suspended his license, pending malpractice and records falsification proceedings. 2 former hospitals reopened files. One family that had settled quietly years earlier came forward. Then another did. The pattern that had lived for years inside sealed meetings and softened language finally had a shape everyone could see. Harlow's reorganization was brutal. Administrators resigned. The trauma service was restructured. Chart auditing protocols changed. Nursing escalation authority in specific hemorrhage scenarios was rewritten in black and white so that the next person forced to choose between obedience and truth would not stand alone in a hallway, while someone with better tailoring tried to outvote blood loss. People expected Nora to take a promotion, make a statement, stand in front of cameras, become the public face of reform. She did none of that. A week after the hearing, she returned to night shift. No speech, no ceremony. She walked into the trauma wing 5 minutes early, checked suction, reset the supplies in her pockets, and reviewed the assignment board. Rosa handed her a coffee. Eli, now carrying himself a little differently, gave her a quiet nod. The building hummed the way it always had, tired, imperfect, alive. Near dawn, Nora stepped briefly into ICU to check on Garrett before turnover. He was sitting up now, pale but stronger, one shoulder wrapped in light from the window. "They tell me you're back," he said. "Apparently they need nurses," she replied. He let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "You ever get tired of being right late?" Nora looked through the glass at the corridor outside, where staff moved from room to room, carrying charts, pumps, blankets, lab tubes, and the whole invisible weight of the institution on their backs. "Truth is usually on time," she said. "People are what arrive late." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once because there wasn't much to add to that. When the sun rose over Harlow County General, the front of the hospital looked the same as it always had. The stones still shone. The donor wall still reflected the light. The piano still sat under the atrium windows, pretending elegance could keep a system honest. But the people in the back knew better. They knew that titles can be loud while competence stays quiet. They knew that institutions often lean hardest on the ones holding them together. They knew that being right is not the same as being believed, at least not at first. And they knew that sometimes the person who saves the room is the one authority has already decided not to hear. Because on the worst night of his life, a Navy SEAL woke in a hospital corridor, looked past the surgeon, past the noise, past the rank on everyone's badge, and called the only person who truly understood the danger by the rank she had earned long before that building ever learned her worth. And that was the part no one at Harlow could rewrite. Not afterward. Not in the chart. Not in the hearing. Not under brighter lights. Because authority can delay the truth. It can bury it, mock it, suspend it, and order it to stand down. But if the truth keeps a pulse, eventually it gets up from the table and says your name out loud. But that still wasn't the end of what Harlow had hidden. Because saving Garrett Wills in the operating room was the part people could understand. Blood, pressure, time. A body opened under lights and kept on this side of the line. That was visible. It had shape. It gave the staff something clean to point at when they needed to explain why the hallway confrontation mattered. What came after was harder, because once the immediate emergency ended, the hospital did what institutions do when a truth threatens the people who were the right titles. It shifted. It narrowed. It started trying to contain not the danger, but the story of the danger. The first sign came less than 6 hours after surgery, when the electronic chart began to change. Not enough to look dramatic. That was never how skilled cover-ups worked. A sentence softened here. A decision framed earlier there. Wording adjusted to suggest concern had been shared. Conclusions had been collective. Plans had already been moving in the right direction before anyone challenged anything. On a tired unit, in a crowded hospital, that kind of revision could pass for routine. Most people never looked at metadata. They looked at the neat final note and assumed the timeline inside it had been honest. Nora knew better. She spent the first day of suspension not pacing, not calling people in anger, not drafting some emotional defense to hand HR. She wrote times, sequence, exact phrases, which hand had held the probe, where Hale had been standing when he called the fluid artifact, which unit of blood was hung before the corridor stop, which monitor alarm changed first. She even wrote down the angle of the gurney in the hall, because memory under stress has a way of preserving strange details, and sometimes those strange details become anchors when everyone else starts talking in smoother language. At one point, she stopped writing and looked out the kitchen window. A delivery truck rolled past. Somewhere on the street, someone was mowing a lawn. A woman in running shoes crossed at the corner with a dog on a bright leash. The ordinary world was functioning as if nothing had happened. Inside Harlow County General, a patient had nearly been transported to the scanner with liters of blood collecting inside him, and the one person who stopped it had already surrendered her badge. The calm with which Nora noticed that difference was the same calm that had made people underestimate her for years. By noon, Rosa called again. "This is getting ugly faster than usual," she said. "How ugly? Not public ugly yet. Internal ugly. IT got a request from administration to classify certain access paths as risk-sensitive. It means they're trying to reduce who can see what before someone from outside asks for it." Nora took a pen and drew a square around the words chart audit. "Has anyone spoken to Eli?" He got pulled into Hale's office. "How long?" 23 minutes. Nora's expression did not change, but she wrote a second word beneath the first. Witness pressure. That afternoon, Eli Mercer walked out of Harlow's side entrance into wet summer heat and sat in his car for almost 10 minutes before starting the engine. He did not go home. He drove 3 blocks away, parked under a bank security camera without consciously realizing why, and called Nora. When she answered, he said nothing at first. "Eli," he asked me what I thought I saw. Nora let the silence hold until he was ready. He said trauma imaging is dynamic. That hallway views are messy. That inexperience fills in certainty where ambiguity exists. He said if I put too much confidence in a rushed bedside clip, I could damage people unfairly. What did you say? That I saw fluid, and then... Eli swallowed. Then he smiled and said memory right after a prolonged trauma can be contaminated by adrenaline, group influence, and retrospective bias. Nora stood very still in her kitchen. Did he mention your fellowship letters? A beat of silence. Yes. That was how men like Marcus Hale operated when they still believed the structure belonged to them. They didn't always have to threaten. They only had to remind younger people which doors they controlled. Did he tell you to lie? Nora asked. No. He's smarter than that. Of course he is. He told me to be precise. He said being precise means acknowledging uncertainty. Nora looked down at the legal pad on her table. Then she said the only thing that mattered. Precision is not the same thing as obedience. Eli laughed once, but there was no humor in it. I know. Do you? This time he didn't answer. She let him sit in that. Then she said, go home. Write everything exactly as it happened. Every phrase. Every movement. Handwrite it, date it, photograph it, and send copies to yourself in 2 places. Do not give the original to anyone yet. He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, you've done this before. Yes, she said. He did not ask where. By evening, Harlow was trying to seal the perimeter without admitting there was a perimeter to seal. The ICU had a new security roster. Chart access required secondary authentication. Risk management was calling people in one at a time under the language of support interviews, the kind designed to make everyone feel individually responsible for preserving institutional stability. What Harlow had not accounted for was that instability was already moving in from outside. Commander Elise Rowan did not operate like hospital administrators. She did not care about tone, optics, or preserving anyone's future speaking engagements. She cared about chain of facts. When she got the first report that Garrett Wills had partially regained consciousness and identified Major Voss before losing coherence again, she requested more than a briefing. She requested the patient's pre-hospital sequence, the body camera extracts from the responding troopers, the EMS intake audio, the chart access trail, and Harlow's credential file on everyone who made key decisions between arrival and incision. By the time she walked into Harlow's executive suite the next day, she knew enough to be dangerous. There are people who carry authority loudly, and people who carry it like a sealed blade. Rowan was the second kind. She did not explain herself unless required. She did not try to dominate a room emotionally. She simply entered spaces with the calm of someone used to facts eventually winning, and that calm unsettled people more than shouting ever could. When she and Special Agent Daniel Pike interrupted Nora's administrative review, Harlow's leadership initially assumed this was about the patient's federal status. It was, but only partly, because what drew Rowan's attention was not just that Garrett Wills was a federal operator. It was that he had called an ER nurse by military rank while actively decompensating, and that same nurse had forced a hemorrhage pathway against the attending surgeon's direction. That implied history. History meant context. Context meant the old scar mattered. Once Rowan heard the description of the scar, she went very still. She asked Nora 3 questions. No more. Where had you seen that closure pattern before? Did you identify him before he identified you? How certain were you? Nora's answers were short enough to tell Rowan what kind of witness she was dealing with. Forward surgical environment. Yes, completely. There are moments when 2 professionals recognize each other not as friends, not as allies, but as people who know what certain kinds of blood loss look like. That was the moment Rowan stopped treating Nora as merely a nurse in a hospital dispute and began treating her as someone whose judgment might have outranked the room long before anyone there understood it. That was bad for Harlow. It got worse when Pike pulled the audit trail. He did not start with accusations. He started with structure, server access times, user IDs, terminal locations, image archive openings, draft saves, final saves, edits, deletes, replacements. Hospitals are full of people who assume electronic systems are soft because the interface is soft. Pike understood systems at the layer where every touch leaves a mark. At 7:13 a.m., Marcus Hale opened Garrett Wills's chart from his office terminal. At 7:18, he accessed the ultrasound archive. At 7:24, he created a note. At 7:31, he edited the note. At 7:34, he replaced a phrase suggesting CT when stable with wording that implied operative concern had already been established before the hemorrhage page. Pike printed the trail and placed it on the conference table without comment. Paula Renwick read it once, then again. "This could be documentation correction," she said. Pike looked at her. "It could be, if the corrected sequence matched the preserved sequence." It was a complex trauma. "Yes," he said, "which is why objective timing matters." The phrase objective timing landed in the room harder than a threat would have. Threats are easier to fight. Timelines are not. Down in ICU, Garrett drifted through pain and sedation while the building above him rearranged its loyalties. Every few hours a nurse checked his pupils, drains, dressings, and lines. Every few hours another call moved through another office. He came awake in fragments, enough to hear a word here, a name there, enough to understand from the tension around his bed that his case had become larger than a rollover on Highway 48. When Rowan first questioned him, he was not fully recovered, but he was coherent enough for precision. "What do you remember before induction?" she asked. "Hallway," he said. "What about it?" Motion changed. He closed his eyes briefly, searching through pain for sequence. Someone said CT. Voice sounded certain. Wrong, kind of certain. Wrong kind. Talking around the body instead of through it. Rowan didn't interrupt. "Then I heard her," Garrett said. "Same voice as years ago. Cleaner accent now. Less sand in the room." He let out a slow breath. She wasn't arguing for power. She was arguing for time. That line went into the record, too. It would matter later. Back at Harlow, Eli followed Nora's instructions. He wrote everything down by hand. He wrote where Hale had stood. He wrote the exact phrase artifact from scar tissue. He wrote that the first scan had not reassured him. He wrote that Nora had not looked dramatic when she intervened. He wrote that she had looked certain in the specific technical way people do when they are recognizing a pattern, not inventing one. Then he sat with the pages in front of him and understood what institutions are really asking for when they pressure young professionals to be careful. They're not always asking for lies. Sometimes they are asking for dilution, for fog, for a version of events with just enough uncertainty around the edges that the powerful can step back inside it and claim safety. Eli took photographs of every page and sent them to himself, then to a personal account his hospital devices could not touch. Only after that did he answer the second call from risk management. The next escalation came from somewhere no one at Harlow expected, a nurse from another state. Her name was Mara Bell, and she had worked at St. Catherine's Medical Center years earlier when Marcus Hale served as trauma attending there. She did not call investigators because she enjoyed conflict. She called because she recognized the phrase in the internal rumor chain within hours of hearing it. Artifact from adhesions. She had heard that line once before beside another bed. In her case, the patient had been a construction foreman brought in after a crush injury with a history of prior abdominal surgery. Initial imaging had been difficult. Blood pressure drifted. The room hesitated. Hale stayed attached to his first impression. Nurses raised concerns. A junior resident raised concerns. The patient made it to the operating room late and died on the table. The official summary had called it a challenging presentation. Mara Bell still remembered the widow's face in the consultation room. The dead do something strange to memory. They keep details alive that ordinary days would have allowed to fade. Mara remembered the smell of prep solution, the angle of the wife's handbag strap digging into her shoulder, and the exact way Hale had said he was concerned about overcalling abdominal catastrophe in a patient with distorted anatomy. She still had no proof from back then. No saved logs. No federal review. Just memory and an old sense of cowardice for not having pushed harder when the machine closed around the case and called it unfortunate. This time she pushed. Her call led Rowan to Lena Quaid, and Lena Quaid arrived carrying something even stronger than memory. Handwritten notes. Residents write notes constantly. Most of them disappear into drawers or boxes or old binders that follow people through moves and fellowships and marriages and children and state lines. Quaid had kept hers because something about the conference years ago had felt wrong even then. The official review had smoothed the event too much. The lesson had been redirected away from Hale's delay and toward generalized communication breakdown. She had written the phrases down because she did not trust what the room was doing to them. Now, in a secure interview room at Harlow, she opened the old folder and read aloud from ink that had outlived the story built around it. Patient unstable. Nursing concern repeated. Attending delayed despite possible intraperitoneal source. Phrase used, artifact from adhesions. Recommendation in conference. Improve multidisciplinary respect. Actual discussion in hallway after case. No one can challenge him when he gets locked in. Rowan let the silence after that note stretch. How many similar events? She asked. Quaid exhaled. Enough that we all noticed a pattern. Not enough that any one of us felt we could prove a pattern. That sentence explained more about institutional failure than 100 policy manuals. Patterns survive when no one person is allowed to hold all the fragments. Pike spent the next 48 hours collecting fragments, credentialing packets, peer references, prior privileges, National Practitioner Data Bank extracts, settlement disclosures, board meeting minutes. Red Vale Regional surfaced first. A smaller hospital Hale had worked at before St. Catharines. There had been 2 malpractice settlements in quick succession, both buried under language broad enough to protect future applications. One involved delayed operative recognition after blunt trauma. Another involved documentation discrepancy after a postoperative collapse. Neither settlement publicly named dishonesty. They didn't have to. Hospitals rarely write the ugliest truth in plain language when they can write around it and move the liability elsewhere. What shocked Harlow's board was not that prior concerns existed. It was how little they had wanted to see them. At an emergency, closed-door meeting, Renwick sat with 3 board members, outside counsel, and a stack of files that suddenly looked less like administrative paper and more like evidence of institutional vanity. You credentialed a narrative, outside counsel said flatly. One of the board members bristled. He had recommendations. He had recommendations written by people protecting themselves from litigation. He also had outcomes. He had donor visibility. Counsel corrected. You mistake that for the same thing. No one answered. That same night, down in the old trauma wing, the staff worked around the widening crater left by Hale's absence from direct care. Dr. Sinai Imani took over operative decisions with a kind of stripped-down pragmatism that made some of the younger nurses almost emotional from relief. Orders became shorter. Explanations became clearer. No one had to perform certainty. If a scan was unclear, it was called unclear. If a patient looked bad despite acceptable numbers, that concern entered the plan instead of bouncing off ego. It changed the air. People stood differently in the rooms. That was another thing institutions rarely admit. One person at the top can deform not only decisions but posture, voice, timing, and risk tolerance in everyone beneath them. With Hale under review, people began remembering more. A scrub tech remembered an operative report that didn't match what she recalled being said aloud in the room 3 years earlier. A trauma nurse remembered being told not to escalate a concern to administration after a patient returned to surgery later than expected. A night pharmacist remembered a surgeon calling for products far earlier than the chart later reflected, as if the record had been rewritten to make the decision look anticipatory instead of reactive. Individually, none of those memories could convict anyone. Together, they formed the shape of a man who had made a career out of turning outcomes into stories where he was always one step ahead, even when he had been dragged there by other people's alarms. While Harlow reeled, Nora remained home on suspension, but home did not mean inactive. She was called twice by federal investigators, once by hospital counsel, once by a state board liaison, and once by someone she had not heard from in years, a retired Army colonel named Helen Markham, who had once supervised theater nursing operations in the same region where Nora had served. I got a call, Markham said without preamble. From whom? Let's say from a person who wanted to verify whether you had ever seen severe abdominal trauma managed under joint special operations conditions. Nora leaned back in her chair. And what did you say? I said if Nora Voss told you a scar changed the probability tree, you should stop talking and start listening. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. They may ask whether your background was disclosed to Harlow when they hired you. It was disclosed to the level required. That's what I assumed. You still keep everything. Yes. Good. Institutions become fascinated by paperwork when truth embarrasses them. That conversation mattered because Harlow made one final clumsy attempt at defense. In an internal memo later obtained by investigators, someone floated whether Nora's prior military connection to Garrett Wills constituted a conflict that should have been declared earlier in the trauma sequence. It was a desperate argument. But desperate arguments tell you exactly where people still hope to hide. Rowan crushed it in a single meeting. A conflict would imply compromised care, she said. What Major Voss demonstrated was enhanced recognition based on clinically relevant prior experience. The patient is alive because she integrated history, anatomy, and deterioration faster than the attending surgeon. No one raised the issue again. On the 5th day after surgery, Garrett could stand with assistance. The ICU physical therapist got him to the edge of the bed first, then to a chair, then 3 steps, then 5. He moved like a man whose body had been broken in layered ways for years and had learned to hide all of them until this last injury stripped the camouflage away. He did not complain. That was not heroism. It was habit. Nora saw him again during one of Rowan's approved visits. You look worse standing up, she said. That means I'm improving. He lowered himself into the chair with care. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Garrett said, You know what almost got me killed wasn't just a bad call. Nora waited. It was that everyone around it knew how to slow themselves down while one man stayed certain. She looked at him. That happens in more places than hospitals. He gave a faint nod. In teams, too. Once someone gets used to being the center of the room, people start handing them reality in smaller pieces. Makes it easier for them to keep missing the whole thing. Outside the ICU glass, a resident hurried past carrying films, then doubled back because he had forgotten a chart. Life kept moving. Garrett watched that movement for a second before speaking again. When I said your rank in the hallway, he asked, did that help? It changed the room. How? It made certain people realize there was history they didn't control. He looked down at the dressing across his abdomen. Good. He said it without pettiness. More like a man acknowledging that leverage, once truth is already late, still has uses. The formal hearing date approached, and with it came a new kind of pressure. Not toward Eli this time, toward Paula Renwick. Administrators live by preserving the idea that every problem remained manageable until they intervened. The Hale case threatened that identity at its core. If he fell alone, Harlow could try to frame itself as deceived. If evidence showed multiple quiet concerns had been muted over time, the hospital itself became part of the machinery that kept him dangerous. So Renwick started revisiting emails. Requests from nurses for policy clarification. A resident concern routed through education channels and answer vaguely. Credentialing committee minutes where settlement language had been accepted with minimal follow-up. A morbidity review where the recommendation had been reduced to team communication coaching instead of individual practice scrutiny. The closer she looked, the worse it became. Harlow had not simply missed warning signs. It had metabolized them into bureaucracy. By the time the full hearing opened, Renwick was no longer primarily trying to protect Hale. She was trying to protect whatever remained of the institution around him. The morning of the hearing, local news vans were already outside the hospital. Not yet with the full story, but with enough smoke to expect flames. An anonymous leak had mentioned a federal inquiry involving a trauma surgeon and an active duty service member. That was enough to put cameras on sidewalks. Rosa saw them when she arrived and texted Nora only 3 words. Circus at dawn. Nora did not reply. She wore a plain dark blazer, tied her hair back, and entered the executive conference suite like a person reporting for duty rather than making a defense. Inside, the arrangement of chairs told its own story. Board at the front, counsel at either side, witness seats angled toward the center. An enlarged display screen ready for footage. Water pitchers. Legal pads. Microphones. A room built to suggest order while handling the collapse of it. The first half of the hearing unfolded as facts. Data. Sequence. Timing. The monitor trends bled down the screen exactly as they had bled down Garrett's life in the trauma bay. The blood bank timestamps. The code hemorrhage page. The hallway footage. The ultrasound clips. Hale's chart edits. His archive access. Quaid's notes. Eli's contemporaneous log. Dr. Imani's operative findings. Garrett's sworn statement. Each item alone was explainable. Together, they became a wall. Hale's defense rested on complexity. Trauma is messy. Imaging can mislead. Memory under pressure shifts. Documentation often trails action. Nursing staff may misinterpret operative thought processes. In some rooms, that language would have bought him room to maneuver. Not in this one, because then Pike displayed a side-by-side comparison between Hale's finalized chart narrative and the preserved machine chronology. Bright colors marked contradiction. Blue for actual event time. Red for entered retrospective time. The red began to look less like documentation and more like paint spread over damage. Dr. Hale, Pike said, did you alter this note to suggest an earlier operative concern than the evidence supports? No, Hale said. Did you remove language indicating CT transport remained the plan? I clarified my thinking. After reviewing the ultrasound archive from your office, Hale looked at the board instead of Pike. I reviewed all relevant data before completing the record, as any responsible attending would. Pike let that hang for a second. Then he asked, responsible to whom? It was the sharpest question of the day because it reached under medicine and into character. Hale didn't answer immediately. That delay, more than any statement, changed the room. Up to that point, he had still looked like a man under unfair siege. In that pause, he looked like something else. A person calculating whether truth or self-preservation offered the better survival odds. Nora was called near the end, and by then everyone in the room understood the facts. What mattered was what kind of person she would appear to be under pressure. Hale's last hope was that she would sound emotional, overcommit, vaguely personal about Garrett, maybe even triumphant. She gave him none of that. She described the presentation, the hemodynamics, the old scar, the significance of damage control abdominal surgery on later blunt trauma assessment, the false reassurance of an equivocal fast in altered anatomy, the physical change in Garrett's abdomen between bay and corridor, the reason she chose blood before lab confirmation, the reason she repeated the scan, the reason she overrode the moment. She spoke exactly the way she had practiced medicine that night. No wasted movement. Board counsel asked, did Major Voss's prior military experience uniquely position her to identify this condition? Yes, Imani said before anyone else could answer. And the hospital should be grateful she was in that hallway. That wasn't even directed as praise. It landed like an indictment. Then came the question everyone had waited for. If confronted with the same circumstances, counsel asked Nora, knowing it would result in suspension, review, and possible career damage, would you take the same actions again? She did not glance at cameras through the window. She did not look at Rowan. She did not look at Garrett's statement on the table. Yes, she said. Why? Because the patient's body was telling the truth before the room was willing to. No one spoke after that for several seconds. When the board recessed, the corridor outside the suite filled with the weird silence institutions generate when people understand a verdict before it is read. Staff stood in knots. Lawyers moved fast. 2 residents pretended to discuss schedules while actually watching the doors. Somewhere downstairs, overhead called environmental services to a spill in radiology. Ordinary hospital life kept trying to continue around the edge of a professional collapse. Marcus Hale sat alone at the far end of the hallway near a framed donor portrait. He looked composed, too composed, like a man still trying to inhabit the version of himself that had always walked out of rooms intact. Eli saw him there while coming back from the restroom and almost kept going. Then Hale looked up. Dr. Mercer. Eli stopped. You've made a difficult process more chaotic than it needed to be, Hale said. Eli stared at him. You'll understand one day that medicine is filled with ambiguity. What separates leaders from technicians is the ability to act without being ruled by every competing voice. Eli's face changed then, not with anger, but with some final loss of innocence. No, he said quietly. What separates leaders from technicians is whether they can still hear the truth after it stops flattering them. He kept walking. It was the first truly senior sentence he had spoken in the entire case. Inside the hearing room, the board returned. Paula Renwick read the outcome, but the words sounded like they had been written by people trying to sound cleaner than the institution that required them. Marcus Hale was removed from all clinical duties effective immediately. Harlow County General was referring the matter for emergency license review and cooperating with state and federal investigations related to documentation integrity and prior reported incidents. Nora Voss's suspension was rescinded. Her actions in the Garrett Wills case were found clinically justified. An external audit of trauma governance, escalation pathways, and credential review processes would begin at once. Formal enough, but reality arrived 1 minute later. Because state investigators, already in coordination with Pike, stepped in after the hearing and informed Hale he was not free to alter or access any further records, contact witness staff regarding testimony, or enter patient care areas pending additional findings. Security approached from either side. That was the moment the myth left his body. Not dramatically, not with an outburst, just with a tiny visible hollowing behind the eyes. The first expression he had shown all week that looked less like strategy and more like the realization that systems he once manipulated were now operating without him. Local cameras caught him exiting through the side corridor instead of the atrium. That detail mattered to people more than it should have. The man who built his reputation in the bright spaces leaving through the back. By nightfall, the news story broke. Not all of it. Not the federal details. Not the classified parts. But enough. Decorated trauma surgeon under investigation after life-saving intervention by suspended nurse. Internal records review. Prior concerns reopened. State board notified. Active duty service member involved. The hospital released a statement about accountability and patient safety. Staff read it in break rooms and said nothing because everyone knew those words only appeared once the machine had already failed. Over the next week, Harlow began the painful work of becoming aware of itself. Consultants arrived. Outside, nursing leadership reviewed escalation policies. Surgical governance panels were restructured. Residents were invited to confidentially report retaliation concerns. That was the first time some of them had ever seen the word retaliation used plainly in official communication. A temporary protocol was issued allowing nurses in specific hemodynamic collapse scenarios to trigger emergency multidisciplinary review independent of a single attending's approval. It was not a perfect fix. Policies never are. But it was the first written acknowledgement that hierarchy can become a hazard when speed and ego lock together. Nora returned to work 9 days after the hearing. No applause. No hallway tribute. No administrator waiting with a speech. That would have embarrassed her and insulted the truth both at once. Harlow had not become noble overnight. It had become exposed. She came in early, changed into scrubs, tied back her hair, checked suction, tested the laryngoscope light, reviewed blood fridge levels, and scanned the board. Rosa walked up beside her holding 2 coffees. "Welcome back," she said. Nora took one. "Anything trying to die in room 3 yet?" "Not yet. Give it time." Eli passed by carrying a chart and paused. "Good to see you." "You too," Nora said. He nodded once and kept moving, but his stride was different now. Straighter somehow. Not because the week had made him older in some dramatic sense. Because he had crossed one of those invisible lines inside a profession where you stop imagining that skill alone will protect patients and start understanding what courage is actually for. That first night back did not deliver a movie-worthy case. No mass casualty. No federal surprise. No screaming confrontation. It delivered ordinary medicine. An elderly man with sepsis. A teenager with a shattered wrist. A woman in early labor who was far more frightened than sick. A chest pain workup. An intoxicated fall. a child with asthma. And in the middle of all that ordinary work, the trauma wing felt almost unfamiliar because the air had changed. Nurses escalated concerns without cushioning them quite so much. Residents asked clearer questions. Dr. Amani, covering again, said, "I don't know yet," twice in one case, and the room somehow became safer because of it. Around 3 a.m., Nora stepped into ICU on a brief break. Garrett was by then out of immediate danger, thinner than before, moving carefully, his body still negotiating terms with pain. He was seated in a chair beside the bed, one hand resting over the blanket, dawn not yet visible through the narrow window. "You're walking now," Nora said. "Against medical expectations," he replied. She looked at the telemetry lead still on his chest. Not especially far. Far enough to irritate physical therapy. That drew the slightest shift in her expression. For a moment, they listened to the monitors around them. Then Garrett said, "Rowan told me they found 2 more cases." "They did." He looked toward the floor. "Men like that don't think they're lying." "Not at first." "No," Nora said. "They think they're preserving the version of themselves they can survive living with." He looked back up. "That almost sounds generous." "It isn't. It's just accurate." The room fell quiet again. Finally, Garrett said, "You know what I remembered after surgery?" "What?" "Not the tent. Not the old operation." He rested his hand more firmly over the blanket. "I remember the hallway. The way everyone slowed down around him. That's what danger felt like. Not the bleeding. The slowing." Nora looked through the ICU glass at a resident conferring with a nurse over a medication pump. "That's how systems fail," she said. "Not all at once. They fail by teaching everyone good enough to hesitate." When she left ICU, dawn was beginning to soften the windows at the far end of the hall. The bright front atrium would soon fill again with visitors carrying flowers, coffee cups, balloons, overnight bags, all the hopeful props people bring into hospitals before they understand what keeps them standing. But the people in the back knew. They knew the hospital had been reorganized not because a mission statement suddenly woke up, but because one nurse had refused to let certainty outrank evidence in a hallway. They knew Marcus Hale had not fallen because evil was finally defeated in some tidy dramatic arc. He had fallen because metadata, memory, witness notes, old scars, and one living patient aligned too precisely for the institution to keep translating failure into prestige. They knew quiet competence was still quiet. It did not become flashy just because it had one. And they knew something else now, too. They knew that the invisible people who keep systems alive are often the first ones those systems punish when they interfere with power. The nurse who notices. The resident who writes it down. The charge nurse who preserves the log before it disappears. The surgeon who enters the room and refuses to protect rank at the expense of anatomy. The investigator who asks for objective timing instead of polished explanation. None of them looked like the hospital's public image. All of them were the reason it still deserved to call itself a hospital. Near shift change, Nora stood for a second in the old service corridor outside Trauma 1. The same corridor where Garrett's bed had jolted to a stop. The same fluorescent lights. The same scuffed baseboards. The same half-repaired world. A transport orderly passed with an empty bed. A respiratory therapist leaned against the wall, writing something on a folded glove wrapper. An intern hurried by with the strained expression of someone learning that medicine is much more about humility than brilliance. And for one still moment, the corridor looked ordinary enough that a stranger might never imagine what had happened there. That was the final lesson of Harlow County General. The rooms where truth turns are rarely beautiful. They are fluorescent and narrow and cluttered. They are run by people whose names never make the donor wall. They are held together by the ones most likely to be ignored until a life hangs on whether they speak anyway. Nora Voss had not needed the hospital to understand her history in order to do her job. She had needed only enough space to act before the bleeding one. The rest came later. The hearings, the audits, the restored badge, the ruined career, the rewritten policies, the cameras outside, the statements from people who had once preferred smooth language. All of that was aftermath. The real story had happened in the seconds before anyone else was ready, when a surgeon with status mistook command for correctness. A nurse with history recognized a truth hidden under scar tissue, and a dying man woke just long enough to name the only person in the corridor whose authority came from experience instead of title. That is why some people are believed too late, because what they know is built in places the polished world doesn't like to acknowledge. In night shifts, in field tents, in unglamorous repetitions, in memories the body keeps, in the discipline to stay calm when everyone louder is already wrong. And when the reckoning finally comes, it doesn't sound like applause. It sounds like a record that will no longer bend. It sounds like a hallway stop caught on camera. It sounds like old notes pulled from a drawer. It sounds like a resident deciding precision is not obedience. It sounds like a federal investigator asking who your chart was really written for. It sounds like a hospital learning, too late to stay innocent, that the people carrying its weight were the people it taught itself not to see. And sometimes, if the truth survives long enough to speak for itself, it sounds like a wounded man waking through blood loss and calling a quiet nurse by the rank she earned long before anyone in that building understood what she was worth.